The recorder was no larger than a matchbox, and it weighed nothing in my glove. And when I set it on the king's writing desk that gray morning, it made a small click that seemed, to me, louder than any cannon I have ever stood beside. I want you to hold that picture, because everything I am about to tell you turns on it. A brass case thing the length of my thumb, scuffed at one corner, warm from 6 days in my breast pocket. And around it the whole architecture of the Palace of Harrowgate, the gilded moldings, the tall windows dressed in Isolde's old damask, the smell of beeswax and cold ash, the 400 years of men who had stood exactly where I was standing and had been trained, above all else, to say nothing, to see nothing, to be furniture that breathes. My name is Emrys Thorne. For 19 years I served in the King's Guard of the House of Harrowgate, and for most of that time I was very good at being furniture. I could stand a 2-hour watch without shifting my weight. I could let a drunk lord breathe wine into my face and not blink. I had a reputation among the younger men for stillness. They used to say Thorne could be struck by lightning, and you'd only know because the metal on his tunic would smoke. It was meant as praise. For a long while I took it as such. So understand what it cost me to set that recorder down and press the small button that made it speak. The king was in his chair by the window, a blanket over his knees though it was not a cold room, and he had the loose, patient look he wore in those months, a man being carried by a current he could not quite name. His sister, the Princess Adela, stood at his shoulder with her arms folded and her mouth set, because she had insisted on being there and I had insisted she must be. And in the doorway, summoned and suspicious, her rings catching the window light, stood the Queen Consort Morwenna, asking in that smooth, low voice of hers what a common guardsman thought he was doing in His Majesty's private study. I did not answer her. I pressed the button, and her own voice came out of the little brass box and filled the room. That is where the story ends, or rather where it breaks open. But you cannot understand a man setting a recording device on a king's desk unless you first understand the 6 years he spent deciding not to. So let me take you back, and I will try to be honest about all of it, the fear included. Especially the fear. The trouble in the House of Harrowgate did not arrive with trumpets. That is the first thing people get wrong when I tell them. They imagine a villain sweeping through the gates in black, and a moment where everyone gasped and knew. It was nothing like that. It came the way damp comes into a wall. You do not see the day it starts, only the year you notice the plaster has gone soft. Queen Isolde died in the spring, and the whole realm grieved her, and it grieved rightly. She had been the sort of queen who learned the names of the men on the gate and the names of their children, who once stood in the rain at a soldier's funeral because she had said she would come, and a little rain was no reason to break her word. When she was gone, the king seemed to fold inward, and for a year he did his duties like a man walking underwater, and we all forgave him for it because we were underwater too. Morwenna he married 2 years after. I will not pretend I saw through her at once because I did not. She was clever and she was beautiful and she was, in those early days, unfailingly gracious to the household staff, which, I have since learned, is precisely how a certain kind of person begins. She learned our names too. She learned mine. Sergeant Thorne, she would say, passing me in the long gallery, the most reliable man in the palace. And she would smile, and I, God help me, would feel the small warmth any man feels when the powerful notice him kindly. She had 2 children of her own from a first marriage, a son, Lord Cassius, who was perhaps 22 when she came to us, and a daughter, Lady Verena, a few years younger. Handsome, well-mannered, entirely at ease in rooms where I would have felt like a nail in a silk glove. The king had 2 children by Isolde. The Crown Prince Rowan, then in his late 20s, grave and dutiful and a little shy, and the Princess Ilara, warmer, quicker to laugh. And Rowan by that time had children of his own, 3 of them, Torin and Malin and little Bram, who used to race their wooden horses down the west corridor while their nurse chased after, and I pretended, from my post, not to watch and smile. That was the household, 2 bloodlines under one roof, and one of them born to the crown and one of them married into it, and for a while the seam between them held. The first thread I noticed pulling loose, I noticed because it was my job to notice. A guard's job, the real job beneath the ceremony, is to sense when a room is wrong. Not to react, to sense. To feel the pressure change before anyone raises a voice. And in the 3rd year of Morwenna's marriage, I began to feel the pressure change around the king. He grew quieter. Not the grief quiet of before, which had a shape to it, but a foggy, unfixed quiet, as if the sharp edges of him were being sanded down. He forgot appointments he had never forgotten. He signed papers his secretary put before him without the long, careful reading he had been famous for. He tired early and he woke late, and the space in between, the space where a king governs, grew smaller each season, and into that space, quietly, capably, flowed Morwenna. She managed his diary. She managed his physicians. She managed, before long, who was permitted to see him alone, and the list of those permitted grew shorter the way the winter days grow shorter, so gradually that you cannot name the afternoon it turned dark. I told myself it was love. I told myself a devoted wife caring for a fading husband. Men tell themselves a great many comfortable things when the uncomfortable thing would require them to act. Then came the night I heard the first fragment, and after that I could not tell myself anything comfortable ever again. It was late past 1 in the morning, and I had drawn the corridor watch outside the king's apartments, a dull post, the sort we gave to steady men because nothing ever happened on it. The palace at that hour is a great sleeping animal, you learn its breathing. I heard a door open 2 rooms down, in the little antechamber Morwenna had taken for her own correspondence, and I heard voices low, and I did what a well-trained guardsman does, which is nothing. I stood. I did not move toward them. It was not my business. But the door had not latched, and the night was still, and voices carry along old stone in ways the people speaking never expect. I heard Morwenna, and I heard a man I knew to be her private secretary, a soft-footed functionary named Pell, Aldous Pell, a man with the eyes of an accountant and the smile of an undertaker. And I heard, across the dark, 3 sentences I have never been able to unhear. "He will sign whatever I put in front of him now," she said. "That is no longer the difficulty. The difficulty is the boy. Rowan has to be made impossible before the council sits, or all of this is for nothing." Made impossible. I remember standing there with my rifle at my shoulder and feeling the cold come up through the stone into my boots. Made impossible. It is not a phrase a wife uses about her husband's grown son and heir. It is a phrase a general uses about a bridge. I heard Pell murmur something I could not catch, and I heard Morwenna answer lightly, as if they were discussing a seating plan. "Then we give them a reason. People believe what they are ready to believe about a serious young man, that underneath the seriousness there is something hidden and unwholesome. We only have to hand them the shape of it. The rest they will paint in themselves." Then the door swung fully shut, and the voices dropped below the threshold of the stone, and I was alone in the corridor with what I had heard. I want to be truthful with you about the next part, because it is the part I am least proud of. I did nothing that night. I told myself I had heard fragments out of context, that I could have misunderstood, that a sergeant of the guard does not carry gossip about the Queen Consort up the chain of command on the strength of a half-caught sentence through a door. All of that was true, and all of it was also the sound a coward makes when he is talking himself out of danger. I stood my watch to its end, and I marched off at the change, and I lay in my narrow bed in the barracks with my eyes open until the bugle, and I told myself I would watch and wait and be certain. It is a very fine line, in a man's own head, between prudence and cowardice. I have spent 6 years walking it. I am still not always sure which side my weight is on. But I did do one thing. In the days after, I did the thing I had been trained never to do. I let myself become curious. I began, quietly, to watch the household not as furniture watches a room, but as a hunter watches a wood. And once I looked, it was everywhere. I saw how the loyal old servants left. Not dismissed, never anything so crude. They requested retirement. They wished to be nearer their families. The king's private secretary of 30 years, a man named Harwin who had guarded the royal seal like a relic, put in his papers within a month of a private interview with the Queen Consort, and the man who replaced him was one of Pell's cousins, a pale young man who did precisely what he was told. The king's oldest physician, who might have said aloud that His Majesty's fogging was not natural to his years, took a sudden pension and moved to the coast. One by one, every person in that palace who had known the king long enough to notice what he was becoming was eased out of the room, and every person who moved in was new and grateful and Morwenna's. I saw, too, how the Crown Prince Rowan was being cut away from his father. There was always a reason. His Majesty was too tired today. His Majesty was resting. His Majesty had asked not to be disturbed, though when I stood the door I had heard His Majesty ask more than once in a small, lost voice where his son was. Rowan would come, grave and patient, and be turned back at the threshold with a soft word from Pell or a softer one from the Queen Consort, and he would go, because he was a man who believed in order and could not conceive that the order itself had been poisoned. He kept trusting the system. That was his great virtue, and it was very nearly his ruin, and I understood it, because I had spent my whole life believing in the same system, and it took me far too long to grasp that the system had been quietly hollowed out and worn like a mask. And I saw Lord Cassius rise. A ceremonial appointment here, a seat on a board there, a place at the king's right hand at a state dinner where the crown prince had always sat. Small things. Each one deniable, each one explainable, each one nothing on its own, and all of them together pointing like iron filings toward a single hidden magnet. Made impossible before the council sits. I did not yet know what council she meant, or what she meant to put before it. But I knew the shape of the thing now, and the shape was this. A woman intended to take a kingdom, not by storming it but by managing it, one soft removal at a time, until the true heir stood outside a locked door and her own son stood inside it, and the king between them signing whatever was put in front of him with a hand that no longer fully knew what it signed. I was a sergeant of the guard. I stood at doors. I had no standing to accuse a queen, no proof but a sentence heard through a gap, and I would soon learn every reason in the world to be afraid of what happened to men who tried. Because I was not the first to notice, I only thought I was. There had been a man before me, and what they did to him is the reason I stayed silent for 6 long years. His name was Denholm Rourke, and he had been my captain when I was young, and he was the finest soldier I ever served under. He had come up the hard way, from a border regiment to the household, and he wore the transition like a man who had never quite forgiven the palace for being softer than the field. He drilled us until our arms shook, and then he stood us drinks and learned the trouble at home each of us was carrying, and he taught me the one lesson I have built my whole life on, that discipline is not the absence of feeling. Discipline is feeling everything and choosing out of duty not to be ruled by it. Rourke noticed the wrongness before I did. He was that kind of man. By the time I heard my sentence through a door, he had already spent a year gathering what he could, dates, discrepancies, the pattern of the removals, a page of the king's accounts that did not add up. He was too honest for his own good and too proud to imagine that honesty could lose. He took what he had in the 4th year of the marriage, and he did the correct and honorable thing. He wrote it up plainly, and he requested a private audience with the Lord Chamberlain, the most senior officer of the household, to lay his concerns before the crown. He never got the audience. What he got was Morwenna, 3 days ahead of him, because of course a woman who reads every diary in the palace reads the one where a captain requests to see the chamberlain about a matter of household integrity. I did not see the machine work. I only saw the result, and the result was this. A quantity of money went missing from the guardroom's own accounts, not the king's cleverly, but ours, the men's mess fund and the equipment ledger, small and grubby and near, the kind of theft that makes a soldier's brothers turn from him faster than treason would. And the trail of it when the auditors followed it, a new set of auditors, Pell's men, led with beautiful, damning neatness straight to Captain Denholm Rourke. His signature where it should not have been. A sum, matching to the coin, moved into an account in his name that he swore on his mother's grave he had never opened. I believed him. A handful of us believed him. It did not matter. There was paper, and the paper said thief, and paper outvotes a man's whole life if enough of it is stacked against him. He was court-martialed, quietly, to spare the household embarrassment. That was the word they used, spare, as if disgrace were a kindness. Stripped of his rank, stripped of his pension, marched out through a side gate at first light with his medals left behind on a table, so that no one would have to watch the ceremony of a great man being unmade. I was on the gate that morning. It was my watch. Of all the cruelties in it, that is the one that still finds me at night, that I stood my post, immaculate and silent, furniture that breathes, while the finest man I ever knew walked past me into the gray with everything taken from him, and I did not so much as turn my head, because turning my head was against the standing orders and I was a very good, very obedient soldier. He stopped, though, just for a second level with me. He did not look at me. He was too careful even then to mark me as his, but he spoke, low, out of the side of his mouth, the way he used to pass an order down the line under fire. "It was her, Emrys," he said. "You know it was her. Don't you do what I did. Don't hand them your bare hand to break. Get the thing itself or say nothing at all." Then he walked on, out the side gate, and the gate shut, and I did not see Denholm Rourke again for 6 years. Get the thing itself, or say nothing at all. I have turned that sentence over so many times it has worn smooth. He meant, do not go to them with your word, because your word is a bare hand, and they have shown they will break it and call the breaking justice. He meant, if you ever move against her, move with proof so complete that no amount of paper can outvote it. He meant, though it took me years to hear the whole of it, proof of her, in her own voice, unmistakable, that cannot be waved away as a disloyal sergeant's fantasy. He left me one more thing. A week after he was gone, a small parcel reached the barracks with no note, only my name in his square hand. Inside was a recorder, a little brass-cased device he had bought. I later understood in the last weeks of his own doomed effort, and never dared to use, because he was a man of Rourke's generation who believed a soldier fought with witnesses and papers and honor, not with tricks bought in a shop. He had meant to catch her and could not bring himself to stoop to it. So he sent the tool to a younger man who might someday be less proud, and more afraid, and therefore, this is the terrible arithmetic of it, more willing to do the low, patient, necessary thing. I kept the recorder in the bottom of my kit for a long time and did not touch it. It frightened me more than any weapon I had ever been issued. A rifle you can be honest about. A rifle is out in the light. But a small brass box that turns you into a listener, a gatherer, a man who is not what he appears, that asks you to become, for a while, a little like them. And I did not want to become like them. I told myself that was principle. Some of it was. And some of it, again, was fear wearing principle's good coat. So I stayed silent. For 6 years I stood my posts and watched the House of Harrowgate be quietly taken, and I told myself I was waiting for certainty, and I told myself Rourke's fall proved that a lone man's word was worthless, and both of those things were true, and underneath them both, plainly, I was afraid to end up on the wrong side of a side gate at first light with my medals on a table. That is the honest floor of it. I was afraid. What changed was not my courage. I wish I could tell you it was. What changed was the children. Understand the succession, because the whole scheme lived or died on it, and I had to teach myself the law of it late, the way you learn the terms of a disease you have caught. By the ancient settlement of the House of Harrowgate, the crown passed to the king's issue by blood to the crown prince Rowan, and after him to Rowan's own children Torrin first, then Malin, then Bram. Morwenna's children, Cassius and Verena, were the king's stepchildren. They were of the household. They were not of the blood, and they stood outside the line entirely. No amount of managing the king's diary could change that. Blood is blood. Unless, and here is the door she had found. There was a provision, old and half forgotten, for a regency council, a body that could sit when a monarch was judged unable to reign, and could set the ordinary succession aside for the preservation of the realm, naming a regent to govern, and if the case were grave enough, altering the line of stewardship until the crisis passed. It had been written for war and plague and mad kings, centuries ago. It had not sat in living memory. It required two things to be convened: a formal finding that the king could not rule, and a body of counselors willing to make it. Do you see it now? Do you see the whole of it laid out cold? She was not trying to change the blood. She was too clever for that. She was building, patiently, brick by soft brick, the two things the Regency Council needed. The finding that the king could not rule, that was the fog, the managed physicians, the papers he signed without reading, the slow sanding down of a monarch into a man who plainly, visibly, could no longer govern. And the body of counselors willing to make it, that was the purge of the old and loyal, the salting of every board and office with Pell's men and Cassius's friends, so that when the council finally sat it would be packed with her creatures. And Rowan was the flaw in her plan, the one thing that ruined it, because even a regency cannot simply erase the true heir. If the king could not rule, the crown's authority passed to his grown son, of age, of sound mind, ready and able. The council could name a regent only if the heir, too, were somehow unfit. A grave young man of unimpeachable character stood squarely between Morwenna and everything, and there was no honest way around him. So she would make an dishonest one. Rowan has to be made impossible before the council sits. We give them a reason. The rest they will paint in themselves. She meant to destroy his name. She meant to hang something on him, some hidden vice, some unwholesome secret, painted in the public mind with just enough color that the packed council could look grave and regretful and declare the heir unsuitable, and set him aside, and hand the stewardship of the realm to the Queen Consort as regent, to govern in the king's fogged name and in the fullness of time through her son. The blood would stay Rowan's on paper. The kingdom would be hers in every way that mattered. And 3 children, Torrin and Malin and Bram, who raced wooden horses down the west corridor and had done nothing to anyone, would grow up as the disinherited offspring of a disgraced father, watching a stepbrother sit in the place that was theirs by right and by blood. That was the thing I finally could not stand. Not the theft of a crown. Crowns are only gold. It was the theft of those 3 childhoods, planned in a warm antechamber over correspondence, by people who had learned all our names. The night I understood the whole of it, I went to the bottom of my kit, and I took out Denholm Rourke's little brass recorder, and I sat on my bunk and held it in both hands for a long time. Get the thing itself, or say nothing at all. I stopped telling myself I was waiting for certainty. I had certainty. What I had lacked was the willingness to become, for a while, a listener in the dark, and I was done lacking it. The next morning I put in a quiet request through the roster clerk. A small thing, easily granted, entirely unremarkable. I asked to be moved to the long gallery and antechamber watches, the dull interior posts near the Queen Consort's correspondence rooms, the posts the ambitious young men avoided because nothing ever happened on them. Nothing ever happened on them. That was exactly why I wanted them. I will tell you now what it is to spend months trying to catch a careful woman in her own voice, because I have never told anyone the whole of it, and I want it set down while I can still feel exactly how it sat in my chest. It is, first of all, tedium of a kind that would break most men. I stood those interior watches 4 and 5 times a week, 2 hours at a stretch, and for weeks the recorder sat cold in my breast pocket and there was nothing to catch. A queen does not conspire on a schedule. She hosts a charity committee. She receives a milliner. She reads to the king in a voice so tender that once, listening through a door with a recording device in my coat, I very nearly doubted the whole of what I knew. She was that good. And that is the thing about the truly dangerous ones. They are not always acting. The tenderness is real too, which is what lets the rest of it hide inside. I learned her rhythms. I learned that the true conversations, the ones with Pell and sometimes with Cassius, happened late in the small antechamber after the last committee had gone. I learned that she trusted the door because she had a guard on it, and it did not occur to her, why would it? That the guard was the danger. That is the strange power of a man trained to be furniture. I had spent 19 years teaching everyone in that palace that I was a fixture, an eyeless, earless part of the wall, and now I turned that long training against them. She spoke freely in front of me because I had convinced her, over 2 decades, that there was no one there to speak in front of. But convincing the recorder was harder than convincing her. The little brass device was old and its ears were weak. Through a closed door it caught only mush. The rise and fall of a voice with the words sanded off, useless. A smear of sound that proved nothing and could be waved away as easily as Rourke's ledgers had been. To catch words, real words, in her own unmistakable voice, I needed the door open, or nearly, and I needed to be close, and I needed her to say something that was not merely suggestive but flatly, undeniably damning. Because I knew, better than anyone alive, what happened to men who brought her something that could be explained away. 3 times that autumn I thought I had it, and 3 times I had nothing. The first time, the antechamber door stood ajar and I heard her and Pell go over the roster of the coming council. Who was reliable, who was doubtful, who might have to be reminded of his position. And my heart went off like a drum, and I stood there with the recorder running against my ribs. And when I played it back that night in the barracks lavatory with the tap running to cover the sound, I heard my own breathing and the tick of the long gallery clock. And beneath it, a low murmur I knew to be treason and could not have proved was anything but 2 people discussing the weather. Too far. The door too nearly shut. The second time was worse. I had crept the recorder up onto the sill of a serving hatch that gave into the antechamber, meaning to leave it and collect it later, and I had it there not 10 minutes when Pell, prowling as he did, came out to check the very hatch, and I had to step in from my post and make some flat remark about a draft and reach past him to close it, my glove an inch from the recorder. My whole life balanced on whether his accountant's eye would drop to the brass box in the shadow of the shutter. It did not. He was looking at my face, and my face, thank God and Denholm Rourke, gave him nothing. But I did not sleep that night. I lay and imagined the side gate. The third time I got words, good words, her voice clear, saying that the king will do as he is guided. He always does now. And I thought, at last. And then in the same breath she said it, laughing, teasing, to the king himself, who chuckled his foggy chuckle in the next room. And I understood that out of context those very words were the fond exasperation of any wife with any tired old husband, and that a clever advocate, and she would have the cleverest, could turn them into a devotion so touching that I would be the monster for having recorded them. Context. Everything turned on context. I needed her to condemn herself in a way that had no innocent reading, no fond second meaning, no door left open for doubt. And I was running out of time, because the council had a date now. That was the midpoint of it, the turn where the slow game became a race. Word went round the household, dressed up as routine, that a council for the good governance of the realm would sit at the turn of the year to assist His Majesty in his burdens. Everyone nodded. Everyone knew what it meant, and no one said it. The physicians had begun, in their soft new way, to speak of the king's diminishment in the hearing of exactly the right people. A pamphlet appeared, anonymous of course, and everywhere at once, hinting in that oily, deniable style at troubling questions about the Crown Prince's private conduct. Nothing you could point to, everything you could imagine. They were painting Rowan. The public was, obligingly, painting in the rest. The machine that had unmade Denholm Rourke was warming up to unmake the heir to the throne, and after him 3 children, and I had a broken old recorder and a smear of sound that proved nothing. I nearly went to Rowan himself. I want you to know that. I stood one night on the point of breaking every order I had and going to the Crown Prince and telling him plainly, man to man, what I knew. And I did not, and it was not cowardice this time. It was the memory of Rourke's voice at the gate. Don't hand them your bare hand. If I went to Rowan with my word and no proof, one of 2 things happened. Either Rowan, being Rowan, would insist on doing everything correctly, through channels, and the channels were hers, and she would hear of it in 3 days and I would be the next set of missing coins. Or Rowan would confront her, and she would smile, and there would be no proof, and I would have shown her my hand and lost it. A bare hand against her was not brave. It was only quick suicide dressed as courage. Rourke had taught me that with his life. There was one other soul in that palace I thought I might trust, and thinking of her was the first hope I had felt in a long while. The Princess Adela, the king's younger sister. She had never been part of the daily household. She lived mostly at her own estate, plain-spoken, unfashionable, a horsewoman who had no patience for the perfumed politics of the court, which was precisely why Morwenna had never bothered to buy or break her. There was nothing to gain from Adela, who wanted nothing, and so Adela had been left alone, unpurged, unmanaged, one clean thing in a rotted house. When she came to the palace, which was seldom, she cut through it like cold air through a stale room. I had guarded her often. I had seen her once make a fawning courtier go pale simply by looking at him too long. If there was an ear in that place that could not be bought and a hand that could not be broken, it was hers. But you do not walk up to a princess of the blood and say, Madam, your brother's wife means to steal the crown on the strength of nothing. You bring her the thing itself, or you say nothing at all. So I made a plan, and it was a bad one, and it was the only one I had. The council would sit in the king's own great study, the room where matters of state were formally done, all dark wood and the arms of the house carved over the mantel. In the days before it, the room would be prepared, and Morwenna, I knew from her rhythms, would go there to arrange it herself, to walk it, to be certain of her ground. She was meticulous that way, and she would not go alone. She would go with Pell and likely with Cassius to rehearse, to run through, once aloud, exactly how the thing would go, because a woman that careful rehearses. If I could be in that room, or near enough to it, when she rehearsed her own coup, when she said aloud to her own son, without any fond second meaning, exactly what she meant to do to the king and to Rowan and to those 3 children, then I would have it. The thing itself. Her voice, condemning her, in a room where there could be no innocent reason for what she was saying. The trouble was that on that day, of all days, she would not want a guard on the door. She would want the room sealed, and a sealed room is exactly the room a guard cannot be furniture in. I needed a way to be there and not be there. I needed the recorder to hear her when I could not stand beside her, and I had one broken old device with weak ears and no second chance, and 11 days until the council sat. That was when I did the thing I am least easy about of everything in this account, more than the listening, more than the deceiving of a woman who had, in her way, always been kind to me. I went outside the palace, on my own coin and my own quiet leave, to a shop in the city that sold such things to men in trades I did not ask about, and I bought a second recorder. A modern one, small and black and cold, with ears that could hear a whisper across a room and a battery that would run for a day. I bought it, and I felt the weight of what I was becoming settle onto me with it, and I understood at last, fully, the pride that had stopped Denholm Rourke's hand. He would rather have lost honorably with papers than won by hiding a machine in a king's study. That was the better man in him, and I was choosing deliberately, eyes open, to be the lesser and more useful man, to stoop, so that 3 children would not have their lives stolen by people who never stooped at all, because they never had to. I have made my peace with it, mostly. Some nights the peace is thinner than others. 11 days, one good recorder and one bad one to hold in reserve. and a plan to get a machine into a room that would be sealed against every living witness. A plan that turned, in the end, on the single fact my whole career had taught me, that no one, ever really looks at the furniture. The great study was cleaned each morning by the housemaids and dressed each morning by the under-butlers, and among the things dressed each morning was the fire. In the cold months a fire was laid in that grand hearth whether the king used the room or not, and beside the hearth stood a tall brass coal scuttle with a hinged lid, an old ugly thing that had stood there since Isolde's day, and that no one had looked at directly, I would wager, in 20 years. It was, in every sense that mattered, furniture. Like me. I could not simply walk into a sealed room. But I could walk into that room the night before, on an entirely ordinary pretext, because 2 nights before the council I drew, through the same quiet, unremarkable roster request that had put me on the interior watches, the late security round of the state apartments, the walk a sergeant makes to check that windows are fast and doors are locked before the palace sleeps. It is the dullest duty there is. It is also the one duty that gives a man a lawful, logged, unquestionable reason to be alone, for 90 seconds, in the king's great study with the door shut behind him. I have stood under fire with a steadier hand than I had that night, lifting the hinged lid of that coal scuttle. I fixed the black recorder to the inside of the lid, high, above the line of the coal, where no maid's shovel would strike it, with a strip of the strong cloth tape guardsmen use for 100 quiet purposes. I set it to run on the sound of a voice. It would sleep silent and wake when the room woke, and I closed the lid, and I finished my round, checking each window with hands I had to order to be calm, and I logged the round complete at 11 minutes past midnight, and I walked back to the barracks the long way because I did not trust my legs to carry me the short one. The recorder would run. The next day the room would fill, and Morwenna before her council would rehearse. Here is where I must tell you about the false dawn, because I have promised to be honest, and honesty means telling you about the night it all seemed to come apart. The council was to sit at noon. Morwenna, my study of her rhythms told me, would walk the room in the late morning 9, 10 o'clock, with Pell and with Cassius to rehearse. My plan was simple and it was elegant, and it depended on one thing, that I could draw a post that morning within reach of the study, so that when she and her party left and the room emptied before the councillors arrived, I could slip in on some pretext, retrieve the recorder from the scuttle, and be gone with the thing itself in my pocket. And the morning of the council, the roster changed. I came on duty at 7 to find that every internal post around the state apartments had been reassigned. Not to me, away from me. The Queen Consort, it seemed, had at the last hour ordered the whole quarter cleared of the regular household guard and given over to a detail of Cassius's own men, young, glossy, loyal to the coin that fed them, for the security of the council. I was posted, that morning of all mornings, to the outer forecourt gate, the far side of the palace, as distant from the great study as it was possible to be and still be within the walls. I understood, standing at that gate in the cold with my heart going to pieces behind my ribs, exactly what had happened. Not that she suspected me. If she had suspected me, I would not have been at the gate, I would have been at a court-martial. It was simpler and worse than that. It was pure, blind, careful thoroughness. A woman about to steal a kingdom does not want the old loyal household guard anywhere near the room where she does it. She cleared us all, the way you sweep a floor before a fine meal, without a thought for any single grain of dust. I was not a target. I was just swept. And my recorder, the good recorder, the black one, my one clean shot, was fixed inside the lid of a coal scuttle in a room now sealed and ringed by Cassius's men, a room I had no earthly way to enter, catching every damning word she would say, and holding it for a man who could not reach it. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I did not. For an hour at that gate I was as close to breaking my discipline as I have ever been in my life. Everything I had built, the months of tedium, the near misses, the compromise of my own soul in a shop in the city, all of it was working perfectly, capturing the whole of her guilt, in a box I could not open. The thing itself was being made, 10 minutes' walk away, and I stood at a gate saluting motorcars. It got worse before it got better. At 11:30 a car came through my gate that I knew, and the sight of it turned me to ice. The Princess Adela's plain gray car, unannounced, the one clean soul in the whole business, arriving out of nowhere on the very morning of the council. I had time only to see her face through the glass as she passed, grim, set, a woman who had heard something at last and come to see it for herself. And then she was gone up the drive toward the palace, toward the sealed room and the packed council and her fogged brother, alone, with nothing but her name and her suspicion. A bare hand. She was walking in to play a bare hand, exactly as Rourke had, exactly as I had sworn no one else would do again. And I could not so much as get a message to her without leaving my post, which meant a charge, which meant Cassius's men detaining me, which meant the one card I still had, that no one yet suspected the furniture, thrown away for nothing. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I stood my post. I stood it while I believed, in that hour, that everything was lost, that the council would sit, that Adela would rage and be smiled at and be shown the door, that Rowan would be painted impossible, that Morwenna would be named regent, and that the only proof in the world sat mute in a coal scuttle guarded by men who would burn it before they ever let me near it. The stillness was the setup. I did not know yet that it was also, if I could only hold it a little longer, the way through. Because here is the thing about a plan that depends on no one looking at the furniture. It does not only work for me. It works on everyone who has been trained, their whole lives, not to see the servants, and the higher you climb, the blinder you get. Morwenna had swept away the guard. She had ringed the room with loyal men. She had thought of the soldiers and the secretaries and the counselors and the princess. She had thought of every person who mattered. She had not thought about the fire. The council sat at noon, and it did not finish that day. And the reason it did not finish walked in on a plain gray car and would not be smiled away. I pieced the account together afterward, from the under-butlers and the one honest clerk who was in the room, and I will give it to you plainly. Morwenna had built her council beautifully. The counselors were her creatures or the timid. The physicians gave their soft, finding that His Majesty was no longer equal to the burdens of rule. And the anonymous pamphlets had done their work on the Crown Prince so thoroughly that when Rowan's name was raised, there was a great regretful murmuring about the questions that unhappily surround him. It was all going exactly as she had rehearsed it, as, though they did not know it, she had rehearsed it aloud that very morning in a room with a coal scuttle by the hearth. And then the Princess Adela, who had not been invited and could not be refused, stood up at the back of the room and said, in a voice I am told carried to the carved arms over the mantel, that she would not sit and watch her brother's crown be given away by a room full of men he had appointed under a wife's hand, and that before any finding was made about the king's fitness, she would hear the king alone, unguided, unmanaged. And if the council would not grant a princess of the blood 1 hour with her own brother, then let it be written down that they had refused her, and let history make of that what it would. It was a bare hand. It was exactly the doomed, honorable, bridge-storming gesture that had unmade Denholm Rourke, and it should have failed. But Adela had one thing Rourke had not. She was of the blood, and the room, packed as it was, could not quite bring itself, in daylight with clerks writing, to physically bar the king's own sister from the king's own side. Morwenna could smile at a sergeant. She could not yet, in front of witnesses, lay hands on a princess. So she did the only thing she could. She agreed graciously, warmly, of course. How could anyone imagine she would keep a devoted sister from her brother? And she adjourned the council to the following morning, and she went to work in the hours between to make certain that, when Adela saw the king would be too fogged to give his sister anything to hold on to. That adjournment saved everything. Not because of what Adela got from the king. She got very little, an old man's confused fondness and a few lucid, frightened minutes that broke her heart and proved nothing. It saved everything because it gave the state apartments back to the ordinary household for one night, and it gave me back my late security round. The forecourt watch relieved me at 8. By 9 I had, through the roster clerk, my dull, unremarkable walk of the state rooms, and a little after 11 I stood once more alone, for 90 lawful logged seconds, in the king's great study, in the dark, with the door shut behind me and my pulse in my ears. The fire had burned down to almost nothing. The room still smelled of the day, of many bodies, of old men's cologne, of the particular staleness a room takes on after hours of people deciding something shameful. I crossed to the hearth. I lifted the hinged lid of the ugly old brass scuttle that no one had truly looked at in 20 years, that a queen who thought of everything had swept past a dozen times that day without a glance. The black recorder was there, exactly where I had fixed it above the coal, its small light showing that it had done, all day in the dark, the one thing I had asked of it. I peeled it free. I closed the lid. I finished my round, windows, doors, the log at 11 minutes past, and I walked out of the palace with the whole truth of the House of Harrowgate in my breast pocket, and this time my legs carried me fine, because a man walks steadily when he is no longer afraid of what he is carrying, only of failing it. I listened to it that night in the barracks lavatory with the tap running, an old habit, though my hands shook so that twice I had to start it again. It was all there. She had rehearsed, as I had wagered a careful woman would. I heard her walk her son and Pell through the whole of the morning's council as it was to go, and in doing it, because she was rehearsing and not performing, because she believed herself in a sealed and empty room, she said the quiet parts aloud. I heard her name the finding they would extract about the king, who is past knowing what he signs, which is a mercy, since it spares me arguing with him. I heard her lay out how the questions about Rowan had been manufactured. There was never anything in the boy, Cassius, that was rather the difficulty. We had to build it from nothing, and we built it well. I heard Cassius, her own son, ask, with what might almost have been a flicker of conscience, what would become of Rowan's children, and I heard her answer light as anything. They will be provided for. They will simply be provided for outside the line. Sentiment is the one thing we cannot afford in this, and children grow up. They forget what they never had. And then at the last, the thing that closed every door on doubt. Pell, oily, cautious Pell, asked whether there was any loose thread, anyone who knew, anyone who might yet speak. And Morwenna laughed. I knew that laugh. I had heard it be kind, and she said, "The only man who ever came close I dealt with years ago. Rourke, I had him made a thief. It was almost too easy. Give the honest ones a ledger and they hang themselves trying to prove they are clean. There is no one now, and even if there were Aldous, who would they be? A sergeant, a footman. Bring me the servant who can outweigh a queen. I should like to meet him. Bring me the servant who can outweigh a queen." I sat on the cold tiles with the tap running and Denholm Rourke's name in my ears, in her mouth, confessed, unmistakable, in a voice no advocate on earth could turn into fondness, and I did not feel triumph. I want to be truthful. I felt grief for Rourke, made a thief and marched out a side gate on my silent watch, and I felt the enormous, terrible weight of a thing that could no longer be unknown and could no longer be unacted upon. I had the thing itself. Which meant I no longer had any excuse to be still. The council reconvened at 10. I had until then. I did not sleep. I did not try. I sat and I thought it through the way Rourke had taught me to think a thing through, not what would feel brave but what would work. I could not take it up the chain of command. The chain was hers. I could not give it to Rowan. He would want to do it correctly, and correctly was a road that ran through her. I could not walk it into the council and play it. I would not reach the door. There was exactly one person in the palace who was of the blood, who could not be bought or broken, who was already inside the walls, and who had proven that very day that she was willing to storm a bridge for her brother. I had to get to the Princess Adela before 10 o'clock, past a palace full of Cassius's men, without being stopped, and I had to make her believe, in the little time we had, a thing that beggared belief. The blood again made the way. Adela rode each morning. She was at the palace early before the household woke. Everyone knew it. It was the one fixed unfashionable habit that made the courtiers roll their eyes. And the stable road ran past the old kitchen court, where, at 6 in the morning, a sergeant drawing an early perimeter walk would have every honest reason in the world to be. No one reassigned the perimeter walk. It was too dull. It was, once again, furniture. At 6:20, in a cold blue half-light, the Princess Adela came down the stable road on a tall gray horse, alone, and found a sergeant of the guard standing square in the middle of it, at attention, holding out one white glove with a small black object in the palm. She reined in. She looked at me a long moment. She had a way of looking that made you feel weighed to the ounce, and she did not ask the foolish questions, "Who are you? How dare you?" She asked the only one that mattered. "What is that, Sergeant?" "It is the Queen Consort, madam," I said, in her own voice, "rehearsing what she means to do to your brother and to the Crown Prince at 10 o'clock, and confessing to what she did to Captain Denholm Rourke 6 years ago. I have stood silent for 6 years because I had nothing but my word, and a queen's word breaks a servant's every time. I am not asking you to believe my word, madam. I am asking you to listen to hers." She sat her horse very still. Then she swung down, and she took the recorder from my glove and she said, "Show me how it works." I showed her, and the Princess Adela stood in the kitchen court in the cold blue dawn with a black box against her ear, and I watched her face change. I watched a strong woman's face go from suspicion to disbelief to a white, still fury that I would not have wanted turned on me for all the crowns in the world. And when it finished, she lowered the recorder and looked at me, and there were no tears in her eyes, only the cold, and she said one word. "Rourke." "Yes, madam." "He served under my father." She closed her hand around the recorder until her knuckles paled. "They told us he was a thief. I believed it. God forgive me, I believed it because there was paper." She looked at me. "You could have brought this to me last night. Why now at dawn in a stable yard?" "Because until dawn I was still afraid, madam," I said. It was the truest thing I had said in 6 years. "And because the council sits at 10 and a bare hand loses. You showed me that yesterday in the very room. You went in with your word and they smiled at you and adjourned. Do not go back with your word. Go back with hers." The Princess Adela looked at me for a long moment more, and something in her face settled, the look of a soldier who has been handed, at last, a real weapon after fighting with her hands. "Not the council, Sergeant," she said. "They are hers. I will not hand this to a room she owns. We take it to the one man in this palace it truly belongs to before they can put another word in his ear. We take it to my brother, and you will play it because you are the one who paid for it, and because he needs to see the face of the man who kept faith with him when no one else in this house did." She was already turning for the palace, leading the gray horse, her voice hard as the cobbles. "Can you get us to the king before 10 ahead of her?" "The morning security round of the king's apartments is mine, madam," I said. "I drew it. Nobody ever wants it." For the first time the Princess Adela almost smiled. "No," she said. "Nobody ever wants the dull post. That is the whole of how she nearly won." She looked at the recorder in her hand as though it were a live coal. "Let us go and be furniture, you and I, one last time." And so we come back to the beginning, to the gray morning, and the king in his chair by the window with a blanket over his knees, and the little brass box on the writing desk, and my glove pressing the small button. Understand how we got him alone because it mattered. The king did not hold his council in his private study. That grand room downstairs was for state. This was his own place, the room where he read and dozed and was, in the mornings, most himself. For there is a cruel mercy in the fogging illnesses, that the early hours are often the clearest, before the day tires the mind down. I drew the morning security round of his apartments, which is a walk that ends, quite properly, at the king's own door to report all secure. Adela came with me as a princess may go where she pleases, and Morwenna's watchdogs, Pell, the the fresh young secretary, the glossy men were all downstairs at that hour, readying the great study for 10 o'clock, certain that the king was where they had left him, foggy and manageable, guarded by nothing but his own decline. We had perhaps 20 minutes. It was enough. The king looked up when we came in, and his eyes found his sister first, and something in his face lifted, that old man gladness uncomplicated that cut me somewhere deep. "Adela," he said, "you came back. They said you'd gone." Then his gaze moved to me and the fog crossed it, and he frowned gently, the way he frowned at everything now, trying to place a thing he ought to know. "Sergeant, is something wrong at the gate?" "No, Your Majesty," I said. "Nothing is wrong at the gate." Adela knelt by his chair and took his hand in both of hers, and she spoke to him the way you speak to someone standing on the far side of a river. "Alaric, listen to me. I need you to listen with everything you have left, because I know it is hard, and I know they have made it hard on purpose. There is something you have to hear. It is not going to be gentle. But you are the king, and you have the right to it, and I will be holding your hand the whole while." And I set Denholm Rourke's little recorder. I had moved her voice onto it, the old brass one, the one that had started all of this, because it felt right that his device should be the one to speak in the end. I set it on the writing desk, and I pressed the button, and the Queen Consort Morwenna's voice came out of it and filled her husband's private room. I have watched men change under fire. I have never watched anything like what I watched in that chair. At the first sentences the king only frowned, uncomprehending, an old man hearing a familiar voice say unfamiliar things. Past knowing what he signs, which is a mercy, his hand tightened in his sister's. We had to build it from nothing, and we built it well. His breathing changed. There was never anything in the boy, that was rather the difficulty. And I watched the fog burn off the King of Harrowgate the way mist burns off water when the sun finally clears the trees. Not because he was cured, there was no cure, but because there are truths so cold they will wake a man from any sleep the body lays on him. By the time the recording reached Rourke, I had him made a thief. The king was sitting forward, his knuckles white on the chair arm, and his eyes, which had been soft and unfixed for 2 years, were his own again, and terrible. And that was the moment the door opened, because of course it was. A queen who thinks of everything is missed in the end and comes looking. She stood in the doorway with the morning light catching her rings, and she took in the room in one swift, clever sweep, her husband upright and awake, her sister-in-law kneeling and cold-eyed, a common sergeant beside a small brass box that was, at that moment, speaking to the room in her own voice. "Bring me the servant who can outweigh a queen. I should like to meet him." For one breath I saw her decide which mask to wear. I had watched her for 6 years. I saw the machinery turn. She chose warmth. She chose bewilderment. "Alaric," she said, coming in with her hands out, "what is this? What has he told you? Sergeant Thorne, whatever you think you have." "Be quiet," it was the king. His voice cracked on it, an unused thing, but it was the voice I remembered from before Isolde died, the voice that had commanded a realm, and it stopped her in the middle of the floor as though she had walked into glass. He did not look at her yet. He looked at the recorder until it finished. I let it finish, every word, and only then did he raise his eyes to his wife, and the room was so still I could hear the long gallery clock through the wall. "That is your voice," the king said. "Alaric, it can be made to say. That is your voice, Morwenna. I have heard it across a pillow for 4 years. Do not stand in my son's house and tell me I do not know my own wife's voice." He was shaking, but not with weakness. "You made Rourke a thief. You made my son a story, a filthy story out of nothing. You were going to put me aside as a fool who cannot sign his name, and you were going to put my grandchildren outside their own door, and you were going to do it this morning at 10 o'clock and smile at me while you did it." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him everything. "How long? How long have I been asleep in my own house while you emptied it?" She did not answer. To her great credit or her great calculation, she did not fall to her knees and weep, which would have been a lie, and she did not rage, which would have been an admission. She stood very straight and she looked, for the first time in 6 years, exactly like what she was. And she said the only true thing I ever heard her say without a mask, quietly, almost to herself. You would all have been better ruled by me. That is the joke of it. He is a boy and you are a ghost, and I would have done it well. Perhaps, said the Princess Adela, rising, cold as the dawn we had come out of. We will never know, because you did not ask, you crept. And a throne that is crept toward is not ruled, madam. It is only stolen. She turned to the door and raised her voice, and now there was nothing furniture about her at all. Captain of the household guard to the king. Now. Boots in the corridor. The old loyal guard, back on their posts as of the night before. I had made certain of the roster, the one small power a sergeant has, and at their head a captain who had known Rourke, and who came into that room and stood at attention before his king, and awaited a lawful order from the one mouth in the realm entitled to give it. Detain the Queen Consort, the king said, and her man Pell and my stepson Cassius on the charge of conspiracy against the crown. Confine them to their apartments under guard until the council, the true council, the one I shall now appoint, can be convened, and send to the coast, and to wherever else they have scattered the honest men of this house, and bring them home. His voice broke at last, but not from fog. Bring me back the men I did not know I had lost. They took her out quietly. There were no chains, this was not that kind of house, and she went with her head up, which I did not begrudge her. A thing that has been a queen should not be dragged. As she passed me she stopped, just for a second, the way Rourke had stopped 6 years before at the gate, and she looked at me with something I could not name, and she said low, "Bring me the servant who can outweigh a queen." A breath. I did meet him. I simply never looked. And then she was gone, out the door and down the stair and out of the House of Harrowgate forever, and the gate that shut behind her that day was not a side gate at first light. It was the front one at noon, with the whole palace watching. The council that had been built to unmake a king never sat. It dissolved the way a thing built on one hidden lie dissolves when the lie is spoken aloud, all at once, and completely, and with a great many careful men suddenly discovering that they had always had grave private doubts. The physicians who had found the king unfit found, on examination, that his majesty was frail but sound of mind, which was true, and which they might have found 2 years sooner had they been honest men. Pell told the investigators everything within a day, because that is the nature of a Pell. The accountant's loyalty runs exactly as far as the account. Lord Cassius, I am told, wept and said he had only ever done as his mother bid, which may even have been true, and which spared him the worst of it. He was stripped of every office and sent away, but away only, not down. The king has more mercy in his little finger than Morwenna had in the whole of her plan. Lady Verena, who had known some of it and done none of it, and had, more than once in the quiet ways available to her, tried to soften what she could not stop, was left in peace, and has since become, of all things, a real friend to the Princess Ilara. Blood is blood, but it is not everything, and character is its own inheritance. The Crown Prince Rowan was restored to his father's side that same afternoon, and the two of them sat together late into the night, and no one else was in the room, and no one has ever asked what was said. But I stood the door, I asked for the door, and it was granted, and once near midnight I heard them both laugh, the king and his heir, a small tired laugh through old stone, and I thought, there, that is what I bought, not a throne, that laugh. The children never knew. That was the mercy I had wanted most, and it was given. Torrin and Malin and little Bram went on racing their wooden horses down the west corridor, and the plan to steal their lives was undone before it ever touched them, and they will grow up believing correctly that the House of Harrowgate is a place where they are safe. They will read the histories one day and learn there was a Queen Consort who did a great wrong and was sent away, and it will seem to them as far off and bloodless as any old story. Good. Let it. A childhood you never knew was in danger is the finest gift a guard can give, and it is the one that no one ever thanks him for, because to thank him you would have to know, and if you know then it was not, after all, quite given. They brought Denholm Rourke home. I was on the front gate the morning he came back. I asked for that too, and the captain, who understood, gave it to me without a word. A plain car up the drive, and an old man getting out of it more slowly than the man I remembered, gray now, thinner, 6 years poorer and 6 years wronged. The king had done it properly. A full pardon, read in open council, his rank restored and his pension with it, the record corrected in the great books so that no child of his would ever again read the word thief beside the name. And that morning he came to collect the one thing the king could not simply order returned. His medals, the ones that had been left on a table the day they marched him out, kept all these years in a drawer by the captain who had never believed the charge. He stopped level with me, exactly where he had stopped 6 years before. This time he turned his head. This time we both did. "You got the thing itself," he said. "You told me to." "I told you to, and then I hoped you never would, because I knew what it would cost you to become the kind of man who could." He looked at me a long moment, the old weighing look, kinder than the princess's but no less complete. "You stood on this gate the day they took me out. I saw you. I have thought about it every day for 6 years, that boy standing so straight while they did it and doing nothing." He put his hand on my shoulder. "I was angry at you for about a week. Then I understood you were doing the only thing that would keep you in the house long enough to finish it. The stillness, Emrys. The stillness was the plan the whole time, even before you knew you were making one." His hand tightened. "You did not do nothing that morning. You started counting the years until you could do everything. There is a difference. It only took me 6 years to see it. I have been called brave since, by people who heard the story and got it slightly wrong. I want to set it down straight, because Rourke deserves the straight version, and so does anyone still standing silent somewhere with a truth too heavy to carry alone. I was not brave. For 6 years I was afraid, and I let the fear rule me, and I dressed it up in the good coat of prudence and told myself I was waiting for certainty. What finally moved me was not courage arriving. It was the fear of the wrong thing at last outgrowing the fear of the right one. The day I found I was more afraid of 3 children losing their lives than I was of losing mine on a side gate at first light. That is not heroism. That is only the ordinary sum a man does in the dark, over and over, until one night the numbers change. But I will tell you the thing I did learn, and it is the one thing in all of this I am sure of. There is a kind of silence that is cowardice, and there is a kind of silence that is patience, and from the outside, right up until the end, they look exactly the same. The only person who can ever know which one he is living in is the man himself, and even he is often wrong, and the not knowing is the price of the post. I stood still for 6 years. Some of it was the coward's stillness, and some of it was the soldier's, and I have stopped trying to sort the two, because in the end the same stillness held me in the house long enough to set a small brass box on a king's desk and press a button. Denholm Rourke's box, the thing itself. The king offered me a commission after. I declined it with thanks. I am a sergeant of the guard. It is what I am. A man should die the shape his life made him. I asked instead for one thing, and it was granted, and it is the only reward in this whole account that I ever truly wanted. I asked to keep the recorder. It sits in a drawer in the barracks now, that scuffed brass box the length of my thumb, its work long done. I take it out sometimes, on the nights when the piece runs thin, and I wonder still whether I waited too long, whether a braver man would have finished it in a year and spared Rourke 5 of his 6. I hold it, and I do not have an answer, and I put it back. And then I go and stand my post. Red tunic, white gloves, eyes forward, still as furniture, a man who does not move and does not speak. They train us to be a wall. What they do not tell you, what no drill sergeant ever says aloud, though the best of them know it, is that a wall is also a witness. It stands at every door. It hears every voice. And on the one morning in a long life of mornings when everything depends on it, the wall can choose just once to speak. I chose, God willing I chose in time. And I am back at my post, listening, the way I always was, the way, if you are wise, you will hope every silent man at every quiet door still is.